So, welcome to Beauty of Colors podcast. Deborah, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, Deborah, tell us a little bit about you. What is your story, and how did you discover the world of boxing?
Well, first of all, my story would take too long because I'm 66 years old. But what I will say is I worked for most of my career in marketing communications.
Mhm.
And at one point, I did promote boxing matches. However, my book, From the Boxing Ring to the Ashram, is not about me in the boxing ring. My book is about 12 of my teachers, or I call them my gurus, around the world.
Mhm.
And one of them was a female boxer from Texas, and she became world class. And unfortunately, she had too many traumatic brain injuries from boxing. And then she had PTSD from being victimized, several times. And she had a very difficult time. She went from 130 to 400 pounds. She was suicidal. She had to leave boxing, of course. She ended up with permanent brain damage. Well, I shouldn't say brain damage, but cognitive um, issues, permanent. She checked herself into a brain institute, and now she is just the most loving, peaceful, positive woman that I know. And she and I worked together at a it's kind of hard to explain. It was a martial arts studio, but it was um, we also had, she taught Tai Chi there and I taught yoga there, and we worked very closely together, and it was all in a beautiful place. And the lesson that I like to share from her is about being thankful. And, unfortunately, people too often tend to think, oh, why me? Well, everything happens to everyone. And so we have to learn how to bounce back. And sometimes it's harder than others. And again, hers was, she had a lot going against her. So, anyway, that is the reason for the name of my book, From the Boxing Ring to the Ashram. And then other of my gurus are actually in ashrams, but they're all over the world and they're from all religions, they're all practices. One is a Native American elder, one of them is a military rabbi chaplain. So they're everything.
Wow. So, Deborah, how does one gain a holistic approach to self-improvement?
So that's actually a good question, especially because I mentioned that I worked my entire life for the most part in marketing communications. I always did corporate marketing communications. I worked 80-hour weeks. I traveled all over the US, and oftentimes Latin America was also part of my territory. And then I would have to travel to Europe and to other places periodically for work as well. And it was extremely draining, extremely stressful. And the only way that I could really manage was through my holistic lifestyle. At the same time, I would like to think that I had a holistic health lifestyle from the time I was very young. I actually had, and I know you'll be able to totally understand this because I know your background, but I had digestive disorders when I was a kid. I went to a gastroenterologist and I tried a food diary to see if there were triggers. And today I have a very restrictive diet because I do feel that there are triggers to my diet. However, the biggest trigger, and again, I know you know all about food and nutrition, but the biggest trigger for so many people and for me was stress. And as a perfect example, I have been managing my digestive disorders very well for most of my life. But the worst flare up that I had, or the last bad flare up that I had, I don't know how many years ago it was, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but it was the day of my father's funeral. So what does that tell you? It's not about what I was eating.
So how did you go from a holistic approach as you talked about to is it nas namastic counseling? How do you say
My
that?
business name is the
Uh-huh.
THE Namaste Council,
Yeah.
because Namaste is a greeting in a common greeting in India.
Okay, okay.
And
So
so
okay, is it counseling that you do in that field? Or is
I
it
am a certified yoga therapist,
okay.
and I consider it a form of counsel because a lot of people think that yoga therapists just teach yoga or do yoga.
Mhm,
And for me, it's all holistic because you cannot separate not only the body and the mind, but the spirit and
mhm,
also the lifestyle approach. So here's another perfect example. As a certified yoga therapist, one of my background areas that my training, which is going to be very different from yours. I'm not a nutritionist, but I've trained a lot in types of nutrition, but in particular from an Ayurvedic perspective, which is the life science from India. And in Ayurveda,
mhm,
they teach us that what is very important are things such as food combining, what's right and what's wrong for food combining, but also what's right for you may not be what's right for me for food combining. What's right for me today, and not even food combining, but just in general, and what's right for me today may not be what was right for me when I was 12.
mhm,
And then also, what I think is really important is when you eat. According to Ayurveda, pretty much everyone's digestive system works best from 10 in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
mhm,
And around the world, many cultures have their largest meal of the day between 10 and 2. And then in the evening, they may have something light. At the same time, there are other cultures in the world where you eat a heavy diet, especially, or a heavy meal, especially beef, which is so hard to digest, and you eat it at 10 o'clock at night. That, again, just it's against Ayurvedic principles, but for me, in terms of just from um, kind of like what makes sense,
mhm.
it's just not logical. You shouldn't be eating heavy food, especially beef, at 10 o'clock at night.
So you have been practicing all of this, Deborah?
Yes, and I started my lifestyle changes when I was a kid
Mhm,
because of my digestive disorders. I also had chronic back pain, so I had to do things for my back as well. But uh, what I noticed was the best thing for my stress
mhm,
was breath work and meditation. And so I started those very young. And that was ultimately how I got into yoga, because many people don't know that yoga is not just the physical.
mhm.
And what I tell people all the time too is you can be a yogi and never do yoga poses. There are so many different ways to do yoga. And
Mhm.
one of my favorite forms of yoga, we call them branches of yoga, or limbs, like a tree limb. And one of my favorite is called Bhakti, Bhakti, and it's the yoga of devotion. And there are different ways to practice the yoga of devotion. And again, my educational background is in cultural anthropology. So I love looking at how people do things around the world and throughout time.
Mhm.
And it's so common that different cultures practice some kind of devotion, whether or not it is religious or spiritual. Many times it's spiritual. And as an example, I mentioned before that one of my gurus in my book is a Native American elder. And I love the Native American traditions, and I've always been so interested in them. And to me, it's very spiritual, but it's also very, it's peaceful and it's connecting the mind, body, and the spirit.
So, Deborah, you talked a little bit about your book. Who is your book for, and where can the listeners get in touch with you? Where can they get a copy of your book? Do you have any sessions coming up? Do you have any resources on your website so that the listeners can refer to those resources and kind of know how to live a holistic lifestyle?
Yes, 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 and yes. And yes, and yes, and yes, I didn't count. But the main thing would be to go to my website, which is my name, Deborah, Deborah, Charnes, CHARNES.com. And on the site, there is a book page. And on the book page, it has some places where you can buy the book, but for the most part, anywhere in the world, it's available from all of the major online sources. So that's one question. As far as resources, it's interesting because I have always tried to share resources. I also have a YouTube channel, by the way, and that's also my name, Deborah Charnes. And in my YouTube channel, I try to provide resources. And when I wrote my book, I ended up with, let me see, like how many 148 footnotes. Now, those are not all my resources. A lot of them are to the research findings that I refer to, but a lot of the footnotes are to direct links on my website for more information. And I actually have one area on my website where it's almost like a photo gallery, but when you click on each photo, you will learn what the benefits of that particular practice is and how to do it. So it's very prescriptive. And then the other thing that I have on my website is I have a lot of information. Well, first of all, I have been a blogger since the year 2009.
Mm-hmm.
I have many, many different articles that are on my blog, on my website, and most of them are trying to be resources. And I do have a search engine on them, so you can plug in a word. So for example, let's say Bhakti Yoga, you can plug it in and everything will pop up. And then also I have been doing a lot of therapeutic workshops, and some of them are available on demand from anywhere in the world because they're video segments. They're 90 minutes long. And so those are some of the different ideas.
Wow. So if somebody wants to book a session with you, they just can go on your website and do that?
Yes. And then, of course, go to the contact page. But obviously, look through first because you can see all the different services that I provide. Because just among the workshops, I have more than a dozen different kinds of therapeutic workshops, and everybody is different and everyone has different needs. So, as an example, and I'm also trained in prenatal and postpartum, and even yoga for fertility. So there are so many different things that I do. I also, one of the chapters in my book is about laughter as therapy, and I am a laughter yoga uh, counselor or leader. I also there are so many different things that I do. And then other specialty areas of mine are for blood sugar management and for bone health, because those are things that we are seeing on the rise. Um, and even it's very sad that in the United States in particular, there is a very large number. And again, I don't have to tell you this because you know this, but there's a large number of children that are getting adult onset diabetes. And that, again, to me, that is because of diet and lifestyle. And I was actually kind of surprised that when I was in India training with my Ayurvedic training, I was told that diabetes is also rampant in India. And in my later trips, it's like, well, yeah, because there's so much starch
Mhm.
in the diet. And and then even things like what a lot of people don't even realize is healthy foods like fruits are sugars.
Mhm.
So there are, and of course, with all the, I mean, there are so many reasons why diabetes is on the rise all over. And then for bone health, diet is so important as well. But again, I'm 66 years old. And so what I look at is as we age, and women in particular, we have to watch out for our bones,
Mhm.
especially for osteoporosis and osteoarthritis.
So, Deborah, your book is called The Boxing Ring to Ashram.
From the boxing ring.
From the boxing ring to ashram. What is ashram?
Great question. An ashram is a center for study, traditionally spiritual study. And I have spent a lot of time at ashrams in the United States, in India, and even in Italy. So, um, so ashrams, there are many different kinds of ashrams, and depending on the religious tone, some of them can be more like monasteries, and then others can be more open for visitors. So, as an example, the one in Italy that I was at, I was there for a month, and there on one day there were maybe 30 people, and then maybe on another day when they had a special event there would be 300 people, so they would have visitors
Mhm.
from all different backgrounds that would be there. So traditionally an ashram is again for spiritual studies and enlightenment.
So, Deborah, if you have any last words for the listeners, what would you say to somebody who's listening to this program today?
The most important thing to me is that everyone can be their healthiest and their happiest. And again, it's, I'm not saying that, we can all, have the same level of health, but we can all, again, bounce back. And the good thing about bouncing back is that a lot of times you bounce higher. So just as an example, I mentioned that I think I always had a pretty healthy, holistic lifestyle. I was always very careful about my sugar intake because my mom passed away from diabetes and there was a lot of diabetes in my family. I was getting my blood sugar tested, all the time. And again, I was always very careful about my diet. And then one day, actually at the gynecologist's annual checkup, he did my blood work and he checked for my blood sugar. I don't know why, because gynecologists don't typically do that. And my weight was within the totally normal zone. I have had a lot of weight issues in the past, but I was at my total normal weight or healthy weight. And boom, I finally got the diagnosis that I was pre-diabetic. And that was, again, probably about 15 years ago. And I stepped up everything that I do. I don't take any meds. I was taking meds at first, but I don't take any meds. And my blood sugar is within range, but I know I'm insulin resistant. I know that. So again, we all have been dealt different cards in life, but let the Joker card be your wake up to push yourself to be stronger and happier. And again, even if it's just something like having a gratitude practice.
Wow, nicely said, Deborah. Well, Deborah, thank you for being on Beauty of Colors podcast.
Thank you so much.